Chapter 25. You're not listening to me. John was listening. He just didn't like what he was hearing. It's a bad idea. In the back seat, Denise huffed her frustration as Hughes drove in the drizzle along the highway that edged the lake. "Where are we going?" she asked. He ignored her. He'd insisted she get in the car with him, that they had someplace to go. When she'd questioned him, he'd played the "you promised to do what I said" card, and she'd complied. The story had broken that morning. Los Angeles Times had been the first to report the connection between the Starlet Slayer's victims and Hubert Vaughn. Thanks to the explosive allegations, other news outlets, papers, radio, and TV had picked up the story. Denise's name had been released as one of Vaughn's assault victims and the person who solved the mystery. Her phone had been ringing all morning. Concerned friends, other actors. Her parents had called and told her they were planning to fly back early to be with her, but she'd talked them out of it, explaining to John after she hung up that she had as much drama as she could manage at the moment. Too much drama, more so because of Kenneth McLaughlin. If John could get his hands on that guy. McLaughlin was behind bars, but thanks to him, everybody knew where Denise lived. The vultures were already swooping in. Media were buzzing over Coventry like flies, and the trickle of traffic John had seen driving by Denise's house the day before had turned into a steady stream. The fans now had to drive single file past the multiple media vans parked out front. A couple of them had tried to follow the SUVs when the team drove away a few minutes before, but a wall of bodyguards stepped into the road to block them. John had plenty of experience with famous clients. His agency had hired more bodyguards who'd already arrived. He'd need all hands on deck until Vaughn was captured. Frank was now convinced that Vaughn was their man. He'd questioned his two longtime assistants, but they had alibis for the murders. They'd admitted to wondering what happened with Vaughn and the actresses he called behind closed doors, but they both claimed to never have believed their boss was a rapist. Obviously, they both lied, but Frank hadn't charged them with anything. Meanwhile, the more they looked into Vaughn, the more the evidence pointed to him. According to his calendar, he'd been in town and had no alibis that the police could discover for any of the murders. He'd even been in San Francisco the weekend Jane Sanderson was killed on location. Vaughn was their guy. Now they just had to find him. All that John could handle. He and his team could keep her safe as long as it took to find the killer. It was Denise's ridiculous plan that was pushing him to the breaking point. "What are we doing?" she asked for about the fifth time since they'd left the house. Hughes turned down a long driveway and parked. "I'll explain inside." John climbed out of the car and slammed the door. Denise had summoned him that morning to tell him she was leaving. Her words echoed in his mind. "I'm not willing to lure a killer to the town where my family lives, where my daughter lives. Now that my address is public, now that we know Vaughn is in hiding, it just seems wise to return to California." She'd actually used that word, wise, to return to the place where all the other murders had taken place. Yeah, brilliant plan. Right up there with the Edsel and New Coke, except in those cases only a products died. Why not just paint a big red and white target on her back and be done with it? He took the front steps two at a time and banged on the front door. James Sullivan pulled it open, his longish hair hanging on either side of his face, bringing to mind the young king from the Lord of the Rings movies. The baby resting on his shoulder ruined the image. "Thanks for doing this, Mr. Sullivan," John said. "It's James, and my wife is Cassidy. We don't do that Mr. and Mrs. stuff here." He offered a crisp nod. "I just need to clear the house." James stood back. "Have at it." It was an older home, not unlike the one where he'd grown up. The downstairs rooms were separated by walls and doors, different from the one-room open concept thing newer houses had. Though the place was old, the grayish-beige walls, the freshly painted trim, and the furnishings made it look fresh and modern. After checking upstairs, bedrooms and baths, nothing unusual, he entered the kitchen where Cassidy was arranging an appetizer tray as if this were a social occasion. She smiled at him. "Glad you reached out." He hadn't known what else to do after Denise's ludicrous announcement that morning, so he'd called the Patriot and asked James if they could meet. John wasn't above using peer pressure. He wasn't above using any means necessary to talk some sense into his client. Reed and Jackie were in the living room and stood when he stepped in. "Thanks for being here," John said. Of course, Jackie gave him that pretty smile. Cassidy followed him in and set the tray on the coffee table. Help yourselves. Reed snatched a cracker and a slice of cheese. What's going on? I'll let her explain when she's inside. He returned to the front door and spoke to James. No media hanging around? No unexpected guests? It's been quiet here, unlike at the restaurant. All the press is in town. Sorry to pull you away. Friends trump business every time. John left James there and jogged back to the SUV. The air was heavy with moisture, and a chilly wind blasted across the lake and through his thin jacket. The forecast called for the rain to turn to snow, but it wasn't supposed to switch over until late that night. When he opened the SUV's rear door, Denise looked up at him. You're making me nervous. Has something terrible happened? This is the Sullivans' house. I know where we are. He didn't miss the hint of frustration in her voice. James has lived here as long as I can remember. John stepped back as the other guards gathered around. Come on. She huffed but marched to the door. Inside, Cassidy pulled her into a hug. How you holding up? Okay, I guess. It's just media. And a serial killer. Why didn't you tell us he was after you? I wasn't sure, and it's not exactly lunch conversation. Cassidy leaned back, and if John weren't mistaken, looked offended. It is with friends. Everything that matters to you matters to us. Is what they're saying true? Did that man, all those years ago? Denise nodded. I'm sorry I wasn't here. Cassidy pulled her into another hug. I'm so sorry that happened. When Denise stepped back, she wiped tears. It's over. We're here now. John hadn't meant the low, that issued from his throat. Denise shot him a look as Cassidy hooked their arms and led her to the living room. Denise froze at the door. Oh, hi. James, Reed, and Jackie all stood and greeted her, though nobody smiled. I got you water. Cassidy indicated the glass on a side table. Thanks. After Denise sat in the empty chair, Cassidy settled beside her husband, catty-corner to Denise. Everybody looked at John. You've all read the articles? Reed fielded that. They think the Starlet Slayer is Hubert Vaughn. He's the man who... He glanced at Denise but didn't finish the sentence. Denise just nodded. But we're not here to talk about that. Then she shot John a look. Right? Right. They think he's murdering his victims? Jackie's voice held a hint of disbelief. Why would he do that? To cover his tracks, maybe, Denise said. Except this has done the opposite. I'll say. Cassidy lifted her phone. A few women have come forward this morning already, and I'm sure there'll be more. Guys like that, they get away with it once. They think they are invincible. One of the victims said today that she thought if she told the truth, he'd have no reason to kill her. If anything, this is going to bring everything out into the open. Denise's eyebrows rose. That's one good thing. I guess we can be thankful. There's nothing to be thankful for, John snapped. And the man's motives are irrelevant. The police are convinced Vaughn's their man. A month ago, he said he was going to Europe, but he isn't where he said he'd be, and his phone is off. He was already a suspect. Now there's an all-out manhunt for the guy. Here's hoping somebody takes him out. Reed looked murderous enough to do the deed himself. John agreed entirely. Until he's caught, Denise needs to remain guarded. I've asked you all to come here because she has this idea, and I wanted you all to weigh in. What idea? Jackie leaned forward, all kindness and curiosity. He guessed Cassidy knew her friend well because her eyes narrowed. Let's hear it. Denise glanced at him, suddenly nervous. Is that why we're here? You weren't interested in my opinion. I thought theirs might have an impact. It's not that I wasn't interested, it's just... But her words faded as she took in the faces of friends. I'm going back to Cal. Are you out of your mind? Cassidy was on her feet so fast he'd hardly seen her move. Why would you do that? My location isn't secret, Denise said. I'm no safer here than I would be there. James and Reed looked at John, perhaps trying to read his thoughts, maybe inviting him to weigh in. But he'd already done that, and Denise had discounted his opinion. Jack's head tipped to one side. I thought you came home because you wanted to be near Ella. Or was that a lie? Reed said. Are you only here because of this killer? Of course not. Denise leaned toward them. I came here for Ella. For all of you, I wanted to come home. Her voice hitched and she shook her head slightly. This is my home. She straightened. I'm not luring a killer. You have protection here. Cassidy waved toward John. Not just that, but you have people. I mean, I know you have friends back in LA, but not like us. Not family. You'll be safe here. It's not about me. Denise took a deep breath. I'm not about to put anybody else's life in danger to protect myself. You guys, Ella. That's why I have to leave. Don't you see? No. James shook his head. I don't see how you putting your life in danger protects anybody else. I don't see that at all. He could use any of you to get to me. That's not his modus operandi, John said. He corners women when they're alone. He doesn't take on husbands or friends or bodyguards. He waits until his victim is vulnerable, which is exactly what you'll be if you go back to LA. There are security agencies there too. I can hire bodyguards. His frustration boiled over. We're not all created equal, you know. We're not interchangeable. I know that. I know. You're not going to find a single bodyguard in LA who cares more about your security than I do. Oh, that silenced her. He figured the rest of the people in the room were reacting to that little tidbit, but he couldn't take his eyes off her. And where do you get off deciding your life is less valuable than your daughter's or your friends' lives? You keep telling me you believe what the Bible tells you. But if you really believe that, you'd take your own security as seriously as you take everybody else's. Denise shot to her feet. Is that what you think? It's obvious. You're wrong, John. I know who I am. I know whose I am. And I know where I'm going when I die. I don't have a death wish. I get that I'm no more or less valuable than anybody else in this room. Doesn't look like it from where I stand. Denise stepped toward him. Did you and your team put yourselves in harm's way yesterday to protect me? We would again in a heartbeat. Would you take a bullet for me? Without blinking an eye. For any of your clients, right? He realized he was stepping into a trap but couldn't quite figure out how to yank himself back out. It's our job. She turned to Reed. You once threw yourself over Ella to keep her from getting hurt, right? His lips pressed closed. After a moment, he nodded. But that was... And you. She rounded on James and Cassidy. You two stalked a kidnapper and murderer to rescue my daughter, and nearly got killed in the process. Is that or is that not true? James rubbed his jaw and nodded. We did. These were stories John wanted to hear. Denise turned back to him. I'm not planning those kinds of heroics, but I do need to protect Ella and the other people I love. Why is it acceptable for everybody else to risk their lives but not me? She faced her friends. Isn't that what love does? Sacrifice? Her question was met with silence that hung in the room for a long moment, and then Reed leaned forward. Love isn't stupid. That made Denise chuckle, though the sound was half sob and followed by a sniff. She wiped a few tears and sat back down. I'm serious, he said. The truth is, as long as people know Ella's your daughter, there's a risk to her. But that's life, right? There's no such thing as risk-free living. I've been told, he glanced at his wife, that I'm the most overprotective father in existence, but I can only do so much. You and I, we have to trust that God is going to protect her and do our best to keep her safe. But we also have to keep ourselves safe, because a big part of Ella's well-being is wrapped up in us. Jackie, me, he nodded to Denise, and you. If something happened to you, she would not be okay. Denise, you told her you're staying. If you leave, he shook his head. You have no idea how much that'll hurt her. Denise's eyes filled again. I'm only trying to protect her. She won't understand. You need to know the cost. Reed sat back. Denise seemed too stunned to speak. Nobody's going to harm Ella, John said. And if you stay here, if you let us protect you, Vaughn won't get close to either one of you. Chief Coates already posting his picture all over town. If he shows his face here, somebody will see him. If he dares come to Coventry, James said, this whole town will stand between him and you. That's exactly what I don't want. James smiled at her. That's the thing about friends, though. We get to love sacrificially, too. Cassidy reached across the space and gripped Denise's hand. You've always had a really big heart, and I love that. But I'm with Reed on this one. Don't be stupid. Denise seemed to vacillate, and then she dropped her head. She sat like that a long time before she looked at her friends. Fine, I'll stay. Yes, Cassidy raised a mug. To not being stupid. The friends echoed the sentiment, smiling. But Denise stood and approached John. She spoke so low that only he could hear. And you called me manipulative. He tried very hard not to look triumphant. Some battles are important enough to win, even if you have to play dirty to do it.
Chapter 26. Denise was embarrassed by her tears, but it had been that kind of a day. The online articles, the press watching her house, the intervention by her friends. John had been personally offended by the idea that she would be just as safe in California. Maybe she wouldn't, but the people she loved would be safer if she left. Her friends, Ella, and John himself, though considering how much he berated her for not prioritizing her own safety, he didn't seem all that worried about his. Was there any truth to his accusation that she didn't value herself? Back when she'd still been drinking and using drugs, she'd deluded herself into believing her press. She'd surrounded herself with sycophants who told her whatever she wanted to hear. She used to find her worth in fan mail, giving up the substances, returning to Christ. Those were humbling experiences, and she'd sworn she'd never forget who she really was again. Maybe she'd gone too far. If, as the Bible said, humility was believing others were better than herself, she'd achieved that. But maybe she'd come to see herself as so lowly she'd forgotten the part of the Bible that said that, like everybody else, she was valuable, precious. Jesus hadn't saved her because he'd had to. He'd chosen her. John had seen through Denise and called her on her hypocrisy. He challenged her to see herself neither as lofty and special, nor as lowly and unworthy. John, and Denise's friends, challenged her to see herself as she was, a child of God, forgiven and cherished by her Creator. All those thoughts swirled in her head as she gazed at the stage in the Coventry High Auditorium. Ella attended a private Christian school nearby, but they'd reserved this room for the evening. Not surprising, as it was the only stage in town. The conversation with her friends earlier contributed to Denise's tears. Being back in this building that held so many memories didn't help. She barely followed the story, so intent on watching her daughter delight the audience. Ella was far and away the best actor in the play, and the most beautiful. And maybe, just maybe, Denise was a little biased. Jackie nudged her shoulder and handed her a tissue. "Thanks," she whispered. Her joy was overflowing in tears. To be home. To be able to watch this. If not for the killer, who no doubt had Denise in his sights, it would be the perfect night. The kids gathered to sing the final number and took a bow. Denise was the first to stand, but the rest of the parents followed suit. So it wasn't Broadway. These beautiful little innocents deserved a standing ovation. After the lights came on, the audience made its way down the hall to the cafeteria, where refreshments would be served. John, Grant, and 3 other guards surrounded Jackie, Reed, and Denise as they followed the throng. James and Cassidy were there as well, along with a new couple Denise had met before the show started, Andrew and Grace. She'd learned that Andrew worked with Jackie, and Grace worked with Cassidy, and they all loved Ella. Of course they did. Denise's daughter was eminently lovable. Denise's attendance at the play had posed more than a few problems for the school because of the media presence in town, not to mention the throng of bodyguards. When she'd reached out to the headmaster that afternoon, he'd been nothing but kind and eager to help. The school had stepped up, ensuring that everybody who made it inside was a friend or family member of a student. All that checking off of names when the people entered had slowed the process, but the play had only begun a few minutes late. The cafeteria looked just like it had when Denise had been a student there. The cinder block walls had been repainted a lighter color, but the fold-up tables with their long benches, the laminated floor. Reed sidled up beside her as they followed the crowd toward the refreshment table. It's like stepping back in time, isn't it? It's bizarre. He smiled down at her, and her tears threatened again. She and Reed were becoming friends. It was more than she'd dared to hope for. She turned to smile at John, but he wasn't looking her way. His attention was riveted toward the cafeteria entrance. Denise couldn't see over the heads of the people to know what he was looking at. What is it? Are the kids coming? They'd gone back to change out of their costumes and would be escorted by their teachers, and a few guards and police, to the cafeteria soon. Did you invite Ms. Boatwright? John asked. Brittany? She's at the entrance, obviously looking for you. Denise stepped out of the line and tapped Reed's elbow. There's somebody I need to talk to. I'll be back. She walked toward where John indicated, John and the crowd of armed men all around. Sure enough, there was Brittany in the wide entrance to the large room, a police officer at her side. She'd looked so put together when Denise had seen her Tuesday, but tonight her brown hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail. She wore no makeup, and her skin was pale. Her jacket was open, revealing a ratty sweatshirt so old that Denise remembered it from when they'd lived together. Brittany caught sight of Denise and started her direction, but was stalled by the officer. When Denise was close enough, she spoke to the cop. She's an old friend, it's fine. The man nodded and moved away, and Denise turned to Brittany. What is it? What happened? Brittany gripped her forearm. I need to talk to you. Her gaze flicked to the men all around. Alone. Before Denise could respond, John said, Not alone. With barely a glance his direction, Brittany leaned closer and spoke into Denise's ear. It's about Vaughn. I think I can help, but I can't. What happened to you today? Them printing all that stuff. I can't face that. I can't. Denise struggled to catch up. Had Brittany been one of Vaughn's victims? When had that happened? How? It's imperative. Please. Okay. Denise took her hand and started walking, ignoring the frustration wafting from John like too much cologne. Most of the school was closed off, but the classrooms nearest the auditorium were accessible. The kids had used them as dressing rooms and staging areas, so they should still be unlocked. In the hallway, they passed students moving in tidy lines toward the cafeteria. Denise caught sight of Lake, then found Ella beside her. Her daughter looked confused. As she approached, she said, Are you leaving? Denise pasted on a bright smile. I'll be right there. Save me a cookie. Ella moved past, and Denise prayed her words would be true. She loved Brittany, but she didn't want to ruin this magical night with talk of serial killers and sexual assault. Once upon a time, Brittany had been not only her best friend, but her only friend. Denise owed her a few minutes of her time. The end of the hallway was deserted, so Denise paused by one of the doors, turning to John. Why don't you guys just wait down the hall? He scowled. Brittany said, Can't we go inside so nobody will overhear? She shot John and the other men a worried, suspicious glance. You never know. Ma'am, John said, my team is… I know, I'm sure you can be trusted. She was wringing her hands. I'm sorry, this is hard. Denise stepped into the classroom, pulling Brittany along with her. Through the doorway, she shot John what she hoped was a placating look. We'll be fine. I'll be right here. He looked like he wanted to push through the door, but she closed it before he could. Hopefully, he'd forgive her for that later. If Brittany was going to say what Denise guessed, she'd need to be away from hovering, hulking men. And if she really had information that might help locate Vaughn, Denise had to get it. John would thank her later. The window in the door was covered by construction paper to afford the girls privacy when they'd changed into and out of costumes. This room and the one across the hall had been filled with boisterous and nervous children earlier in the night. Long before that, Denise had studied English in this room. She could still remember Mr. Halpern waxing philosophical about the use of everyday language to paint vivid word pictures. The students had to memorize a poem and recite it to the class, and Denise had chosen Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. She'd always loved Robert Frost. She flipped on the light. How did you find… She turned, and her voice faded. Brittany was close. Too close. She had a knife in her right hand, held high, like she'd been an instant from stabbing it into Denise's heart. A scream caught in Denise's throat. She tried to force it out, backing up until she bumped into the wall. "Silence," Brittany said. Denise clamped her lips closed. They stood like that, saying nothing, while indecision played in Brittany's eyes. And then she backed up, and Denise saw a gun in her other hand. A backup plan. Denise couldn't catch up. Surely Brittany wasn't a serial killer. But what else would explain this? If she was, then she'd already murdered plenty of women. Why the hesitation? Brittany's gaze flicked all around the room. She seemed confused. But then the indecision slid off her face, replaced by determination. "Come on!" She grabbed Denise's arm and propelled her away from the door, not letting up her firm grip. "If you scream or try to alert the men out there, I'll shoot you. And they'll burst in here, and I'll shoot them, starting with the one in charge. John. And his men. They were all in danger. There's no escaping this for me." Brittany yanked Denise past desks that had been pushed to one side toward the back corner. "By tomorrow, everybody will know the truth, so I have nothing to lose. Absolutely nothing. You understand what I'm saying?" Denise didn't. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. Brittany stopped and whirled Denise so they were face to face. Her eyes were bulging, her skin mottled. She barely resembled the put-together woman Denise had met at the park earlier that week. "You understand?" Terror bubbled up from Denise's middle, tried desperately to claw its way out. But John was outside that door. And the other men. And, just down the hall, Ella. Hadn't Denise just lectured her friends about sacrificial love? Hadn't she just claimed to be willing to put herself in harm's way to protect others? It was time to put her love to the test. "I understand." Brittany pushed her toward a door on the side wall. "Open it." Denise did, and was shoved into the next classroom. It was dark, the only light spilling in from the room they'd just vacated, and the moon outside. They headed toward a window. "Leave your phone here." Denise pulled her phone from her pocket and set it on a nearby desk. Brittany nodded to the window. "Go on, lift it." Denise disengaged the lock and pushed the window up. "Climb out. If you take off, I'll shoot you, and I won't stop with you. It'll be a bloodbath." She'd sheathed her knife and now patted the pocket of her jacket. "I brought plenty of rounds. Everybody will pay for what you did. I'll make sure of it. Don't think I won't. I've done as bad or worse already." Images assaulted Denise. People shot, bleeding to death. All those children, teachers, Reed and Jackie, James and Cassidy, John, Ella. John wouldn't let that happen. He'd take Brittany down. Unless she took him down first. Either way, if Denise didn't do what she was told, she wouldn't be alive to see how the story ended. She climbed out and dropped to the grass. Everything in her wanted to run, but there were no trees nearby, no bushes. Nowhere to hide. And even if she could, she wouldn't put anybody else's life in danger. The faster she could get Brittany away from the school, the better. Brittany landed beside her, grabbed her arm, and rushed around the building, not toward the parking lot, but straight toward the tree line. Denise kept up, half running, half being dragged, as they crossed the grassy area behind the school, skirted the field, and entered the woods. They reached the chain-link fence that surrounded the grounds. Brittany must have planned to escape this way all along, because one section of it had been cut and pulled back. They barely slowed as they made it through. Brittany and Denise entered a backyard, ran between the houses, and came out on a quiet street. There were no lights, and the houses were far enough from the road that they afforded little illumination. A van was parked just ahead. Brittany yanked open the back door and shoved Denise inside. Denise crawled across the metal floor, away from Brittany, and the gun pointed at her middle. With her free hand, Brittany yanked a cell phone from her pocket and lit the flashlight, aiming it into the cargo space. The light landed on a set of zip-tie cuffs that had been threaded through a door handle. "Put them on." "I don't understand, Brittany. What are you doing?" "I should have just—" She shook her head. "It's fine. It's better this way." "Why are you—" "Because you were my friend, or so I thought." She wiggled the gun. "Put them on, now!" Denise did as she was told, keeping the ties wide enough that she could wiggle out of them when Brittany wasn't looking. But Brittany hopped into the van, checked the zip ties, and yanked them so tight that the plastic dug into Denise's wrists. Then she closed the rear door and climbed into the driver's seat. A moment later, they were turning out of the neighborhood, away from Ella, away from John, away from safety.
Chapter 27. John glanced at his watch. What was keeping Denise? He understood that she wanted to talk to her friend, but Ella was already in the cafeteria, probably eating cookies and looking for her mother. Whatever Brittany had to say, it could have waited a couple of hours. Was Brittany working for some media outlet? Would she sell her story to the highest bidder? Whatever information she had, assuming she had anything at all, ought to be turned over to the CBI, not debated with Denise. The whole thing felt fishy. He should have put up more of a fight, but what trouble could the two women get into in a high school classroom? With John and his team in the hallway, nobody would be getting inside. At the 4-minute mark, he started to worry that Ella wouldn't be the only one missing Denise. What if the media or somebody else had seen them go down the hall? Could somebody get photos from outside? He spoke into his comm unit. Ian, head around back by the classrooms on the north side and stand guard. Make sure nobody's looking in the windows. Copy, the youngest bodyguard said. What you thinking, boss? Marcus asked. Just taking precautions. The comms went silent. After 3 minutes, Ian said, All's quiet back here. You see them inside? No, but only a portion of the room is visible. Stay in guard, John said. 14 more minutes passed. John was pacing outside the doorway, debated knocking. When he passed the door to the neighboring room, a chill wound around his ankles. A chill? He pushed open the door and stepped into the darkness. A window was open. Swearing under his breath, he rushed to the back, where a door connected the two classrooms. He stepped into the brightly lit room. Empty. Hot rage mixed with cold fury, neither of which would help. He tapped his comm. They're gone. Out the window. Ian, start a search behind the school. Hughes? He gave more instructions while he yanked out his phone. He wouldn't think about the way his hands were shaking. He needed to focus. Fast. Before she got too far away. He tapped the locator app and saw the tiny blue dot already miles from the school. They must have left before Ian got in place. He told his team to gather and bolted toward the parking lot. He was nearly there when he dialed Coat. Chief Co. Denise Masters has been taken. When? John appreciated that the police chief didn't ask how it happened or any of the other stupid questions that would need to be answered later. 20 minutes ago, she's wearing a locator. She's on a road called, he glanced at his phone, Shasta. Goes up Matt Coventry. Suspect is Brittany Boatwright. My team and I are en route. We're going to retrieve her. I need you to. I appreciate that you guys are trained, but so are we. I'm taking point, but I'll appreciate your help. Now listen here. This is my town and I'm in charge of law and order. Your team needs to stand down. John was only half listening as he climbed into the passenger's seat and connected his phone to the navigation system. Coat was still talking, now the sound coming over the speakers. Hughes started driving toward the blue dot, which was winding its way along a road that switched back up the mountain. Coat finished with, You understand me, son? We'll let you know where they stop. The man was shouting when John disconnected. Team 2's on their way, Hughes said. What's the plan? 2 more guards had piled into the back seat and another SUV followed. They were all connected on comms. Get her back, John said. Hughes nodded, lips pressed closed. These were bodyguards, not special forces. Yes, they were all trained, but they'd never gone on a mission like this before. Not together anyway. That summer when John had lost his client, his partner had been shot and incapacitated. John and a friend of his client's, a guy he hadn't liked or trusted prior to that, managed to locate the client and capture the criminals who'd taken her. He'd wished for a team then. Now he had one. But would it be enough to rescue Denise? Or would he lose her like he'd lost that other one so many years before? Images filled his mind. All those young women, beautiful, innocent, terrified. 14 had been kidnapped. 13 had been rescued. He'd never forgiven himself the stray bullet that had taken the young model's life. It hadn't been his bullet, but he hadn't stood in the way of it either. He'd replayed that moment a million times, thought of 100 ways he could have protected that girl, all the things he should have done differently. Despite the family's heartfelt thanks when he returned their daughter's body, he'd never let himself forget. Never. And now, he imagined a similar circumstance, only instead of a stranger's body, it was Denise's. Instead of a family he'd never met before, it was Ella who would grieve forever. Reed's words from that afternoon rang in his ears. If something happened to Denise, Ella would not be okay. She would never be the same. No, no. He wasn't going to return with a lifeless body. Not this time. You okay, boss? Hughes twisted around a corner, then glanced John's direction. John didn't know what he'd said or done to elicit the other man's question. Drive faster. Hughes nodded forward. Trying to keep us on the road. Snow fluttered in the beam of the headlights. It had still been drizzling at the school, but the higher they climbed, the colder it must be. It already stuck to the narrow country road. One more obstacle. What else could go wrong? The little blue dot on the navigation system stopped. When it stayed stationary, John dialed the chief again. Where are you? Coate demanded. Almost to Shasta. He enlarged the map to see the names of the roads. Looks like they stopped at the corner of Shasta and Overlook. Shasta and, okay, there's an empty building there. Used to be a video store. I'm assembling a team and the last thing we need is for this to turn into a hostage situation. It'll be better if you don't go in with sirens and lights. We don't want to alert Brittany that we know where they are. Let my team go in and take the suspect out and... You mean kill her? I mean stop her. Though he wouldn't hesitate to do whatever he had to do to save Denise's life. I'm on my way now, the chief said. There's a farm stand about a half-mile before the video store. It'll be deserted. Meet me there, and we'll make a plan when I arrive. Don't do anything until I do. Copy. He acknowledged the order, even if he had no intention of following it, because the police had to follow a bunch of rules. They had limits to what they could do in order to secure Denise's release. He wasn't concerned with rules. He was going to get her back or die trying.
Chapter 28. The only thing keeping Denise sane was her steady stream of prayers. God knew where she was. He knew exactly what Brittany was planning, assuming any of this had been her plan. Denise didn't think so, certainly not Plan A. That knife said Plan A would have been a lot quicker. Brittany had planned to stab Denise like she'd stabbed the other victims, and leave her to die. She hadn't intended for Denise to leave that classroom alive. But, maybe it meant something that she hadn't been able to go through with it. Maybe it meant something that she'd brought the gun as backup. Even though Brittany had been driving, paying Denise little attention, Denise was careful not to look at her watch, at the tiny silver charm dangling from it. The last thing she wanted was to alert Brittany to the tracker. Surely John knew by now that they were gone from the school. Surely he was closing in. She prayed he would do so stealthily. She didn't want to know what Brittany would do if she saw him coming. There's no escaping this for me. Did Brittany think she'd end up in prison? Or did she plan to kill herself? If the second, would she hesitate to take Denise with her? The van had slowed, turned, and come to an abrupt stop a few moments ago. Brittany had cut the engine and climbed out. All was silent for a minute, maybe two. Denise didn't bother to try to get out of the plastic cuffs. She'd wasted enough energy on that, but they were cinched too tightly. The rear door opened, and Brittany climbed in. "Where are we?" But her former friend ignored her as she approached. If Denise had any self-defense ability at all, when the cuffs came off might be the time to try to get away. But Brittany was taller, stronger. She'd spent hours in the gym back when they were roommates, trying to mold herself into the perfect shape, hoping that being physically fit would open doors for her. It hadn't, but she'd continued with the training anyway, claiming she enjoyed the feeling of power it gave her. CrossFit, boxing, martial arts. She'd competed, earned belts. Denise had only ever exercised enough to keep her figure. No way she could defeat her, even compete with her in a fight. Brittany cut the plastic and stepped back, transferring the gun to her right hand. Denise shook out her aching wrists. "What now?" Brittany climbed out of the van, never taking her eyes or aim, off Denise. Come on! Denise did, sliding out onto asphalt covered in a half-inch of snow. They were at the back of a small, squat building, surrounded on 3 sides by trees. Brittany grabbed Denise's arm and propelled her forward. Move! Denise stumbled toward a door that was propped open with a rock. She pulled it open. It was metal and heavy, and stepped into a space lit by an electric lantern sitting on a desk a few feet away. It was a tiny, windowless room, smaller than Denise's closet in Beverly Hills. The desk had been pushed up against one side, a chair beside it. A file cabinet and a few racks of empty shelves lined one wall. A door on the far side of the room was closed. The rear door slammed with a heavy whump, blocking out the sound of life outside, leaving deadly silence. Sit, Brittany said. Denise headed for the only chair, but a strong hand gripped her shoulder and redirected her. There, on the floor. She settled with her back against the wall, while Brittany moved the chair and sat a few feet away, looking down at her. The floor was concrete, freezing cold. The lantern gave off just enough light for Denise to see Brittany, and the gun aimed at Denise's head. She was trapped in this tiny room with no escape, with a madwoman bent on her death. Terror bubbled up, and she swallowed a scream. What now? She quelled the question, feeling it would be wiser to let Brittany lead. At least she wasn't bleeding to death on the floor of her high school. But would she die here, miles rather than feet from the people she loved? Brittany glared at her, the look so murderous that Denise's already racing heart picked up speed. This is your fault, Brittany said. Okay? You should have told me. Told you what? About Vaughn. You should have told me what he did. He raped you, and you never said a word. She wasn't sure why her having been one of Vaughn's victims made her Brittany's enemy, but in Brittany's eyes, it clearly did. It didn't make sense, though. If Brittany was the serial killer, then she'd been sending Denise information for a week, targeting her days before the stories had been released that day. She didn't understand. Why didn't you tell me? Brittany's voice was loud in the small space. I didn't tell anybody. It was a very difficult. Don't give me that crap. He attacked you, and you got a job out of the deal. I didn't take it. Vaughn had nothing to do with my success. Brittany wiggled the gun, and Denise pressed her back against the concrete wall as if another few centimeters could save her. Come on, Denise. Tell the truth. It's just you and me here now. The truth? Is that what you came for? Fine. Vaughn raped me. I was so... You know how I was back then, so deep in postpartum. When he did that, it wrecked me. I tried to pretend it never happened, to make life with Reed and Ella work. But I couldn't do it. Guilt, shame, depression. My emotions lied to me. They told me I wasn't good enough for my family. So I left, went to LA. With you, my friend. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she had to quell a sob. Because Brittany had been her friend, for a time, her very best friend. How had it come to this? Brittany's hard expression didn't soften the slightest. She glanced at her phone. Denise couldn't see the screen, but it glowed on Brittany's face. What could she possibly be looking at? I went to California, Denise said. I went to auditions. I landed an agent. I did all the things. And you're claiming that none of that had anything to do with Vaughn. I never spoke to or had any contact with Hubert Vaughn after the casting call in Manchester. I saw him from afar a few times, but I went out of my way to avoid him. I wanted nothing to do with him. He has nothing to do with my career. Nothing. Brittany's eyes narrowed, seeming to seek the truth in Denise's statement. He probably put in a good word for you or something. If he did, I'm not aware of it. If I had been, I would have spurned his help. I never wanted anything from him. Brittany stared at her a long moment, then shook her head fast. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. He raped you. You should have told me. You think I owed that to you? Why? He's a rapist. Somebody should have stopped him. Denise nodded slowly, trying to read the truth in her old friend's expression. Did he? But she clamped her lips closed, not ready to ask that question. How did you find the other victims? A smile spread across Brittany's face. You remember Ricky Rybold? Denise didn't think she'd ever heard that name before. She shook her head. Brittany exhaled frustration. Rybold. Come on, Denise. Vaughn's assistant. When we auditioned, it was Vaughn, Ricky, and Tennyson. I never knew the others' names. Why doesn't that surprise me? You only ever cared about you. The words hit their mark. Denise had once been that self-absorbed. But I cared about you. Brittany glanced at her phone again. What was on there that kept capturing her attention? Or was this such a run-of-the-mill situation for Brittany that she was bored? Right up until you got famous, Brittany said. And then you forgot all about me. Did you think we'd live together forever? She'd moved out of their shared apartment and moved on with her life. Now didn't seem the time to remind Brittany that she'd also covered most of the rent in that shared apartment for years, that Brittany's odd jobs never seemed to earn enough money. Denise didn't bring up the fact that Brittany had been so angry at the time, at Hollywood, at the unfairness, and at Denise, that she'd been nearly impossible to live with. I didn't forget about you, This isn't about that. It's about what you knew. Ricky remained Vaughn's assistant for years. I got to know Ricky, dated him, gained access to his accounts. It didn't hurt that the guy liked to party. He has no memory of me taking his phone and digging through his emails while he was passed out on the bed. I found his travel plans, years of confirmation emails from their travel agent. I put that information together with casting calls and then with actors who were discovered at those casting calls. Actors who chose not to take him down but to profit off him. She glared at Denise. Actors like you. The accusation made Denise itch to defend herself. She held her tongue. She needed to be careful here, very careful if she wanted to survive.
Chapter 29. John moved through the woods, giving the small building a wide berth. Because of the snow, he couldn't get closer without risking footprints being seen. He'd had Hughes drive past the building at normal speed, then stop about 50 yards beyond it. John and Grant had climbed out. Like him, Grant had been a Green Beret. He was the only one on the team John had served with. He was experienced, and John trusted his skills more than he did anybody else's. Marcus and Smitty climbed from the second SUV. As soon as they were out, both SUVs did a U-turn. Hughes would hang close while the other headed to the farm stand. John led Marcus silently through the woods toward the rear of the property. Grant and Smitty had jogged on the opposite side of the road and would check out the front and the far edge of the property. Everybody was silent in his ear, though the remainder of his team and the police were assembling at the farm stand down the road. Coate would be demanding to speak to him, demanding to know what was going on. John's team would put him off as long as they could. John angled toward the back of the structure and caught sight of a van parked near the rear door. The van had no snow on it, but the ground beneath it was covered with fresh powder. It was the confirmation he needed. He took a photo with his phone and sent it to Hughes, who would share the information with the rest. John wouldn't risk speaking. With the snowfall muffling noise, the only sound was the whisper of the breeze through the branches overhead. His voice would resonate. Even the snap of a branch would carry in the stillness. So he moved slowly, carefully. Behind him, Marcus did the same. Brittany couldn't know they were onto her. The last thing he wanted was to alert her to their presence. That would only serve to hurry her up. The back door was closed, the van parked right in front of it. He moved to put the vehicle between himself and the door and jogged in that direction. As long as the woman didn't round the van to the passenger side, she wouldn't see the footprints. If she did come out, he'd be there. He'd take her down. He peeked into the van, hoping to find Denise, but it was empty. The women had to be inside the building. John tapped his comm twice to let Grant know he was coming, then returned to the woods. He kept his voice so low it was hardly audible in the silence. Stay here and keep watch. You see any movement? You let me know. Marcus nodded and John picked his way toward where Hughes would have left the van. When he was far enough away that, even if Brittany were listening, she wouldn't hear, he broke into a run, dodging brush and bushes and down trees. He met up with Grant, who'd left Smitty to watch the street-facing side of the structure, and together they jogged to the waiting SUV. Hughes and Ian stepped out. Rear door's closed, John said. Probably locked. No windows on that side. It's an old store, Grant added, with lots of windows in front. All quiet, no lights. John asked, "Can we get in?" Grant lifted the tailgate, rifled through their supplies, lifted a tool. "No problem." Silently, Grant gave him a don't ask stupid questions look. "Good." John dug through the supplies himself, grabbing what he'd need. He found the items he'd packed into the SUV, never believing he'd have to use them, and handed them to Hughes. "You got this?" He'd been an explosives expert back in the day. John trusted him with the task. "The van? It's close to the building in the woods. Let's not start a forest fire." "I got it." His confidence boosted John's. He turned to Ian. "Stay in the woods and provide cover. Keep one eye on the back door." "Got it," Ian said. A simple distract and grab. John met his teammates' gazes. "We'll figure out where they are, set the charge, then enter from the opposite door." All three men said, "Copy." John took the synchronized response as a good sign as he led them back to the building.
Chapter 30. Denise's first inclination was to argue with Brittany's assertion that she'd profited off the rape. It was ludicrous. But the other women had done just that, in a way. Hadn't she and John reached the same conclusion? What had he called it? Payment after the fact. Denise understood the women's reasoning. There was no undoing what Vaughn had done. Why not squeeze the lemonade from the lemon, so to speak? Denise hadn't had the emotional wherewithal to do even that. Neither of them spoke. Brittany stared at her, daring her to disagree. If Denise stayed quiet, would it stretch out this moment, or only hasten the end? "How do I get through this, Lord? How do I survive?" When Brittany glanced at her gun, Denise decided talking was the better bet. "I didn't profit from it." "Right. You're just like the rest of them. One of the many who got famous because they kept their mouths shut." "He offered me a job, Brittany. I didn't take it. You were with me. You know how I got started." Brittany glared at her. There were a couple who reported him to the local police, but Vaughn had a team of lawyers. No prosecutor ever wanted to take him on. Add to that the promise of fame, and for some, a huge payoff, and it was enough for all of them to keep silent. "Did you go to the police?" She shook her head. "I wasn't in the frame of mind. I just wanted to pretend." "It doesn't matter." Brittany shot to her feet, glaring down at her. "I don't care, don't you see? If you'd told me, then I'd have been warned." She tapped her chest with her free hand. "Then it wouldn't have happened to me." Any compassion Denise felt for her was quickly chased away by fear. And a little bit of frustration. Did Brittany only think of herself? Yes, she'd gone through something horrible. And yes, Denise should have told the truth long before. But some of Vaughn's victims, and Brittany's victims, had been attacked before Denise. She didn't blame them or hate them because they hadn't told. She felt compassion for them. Where was Brittany's compassion? Gone. Maybe swallowed up by her anger and bitterness. This wasn't the Brittany Denise had shared her dreams and disasters with. This wasn't the woman she'd once called friend. But there had to be some of that friendship left, didn't there? What else would explain the fact that Denise was still alive? "Can I ask you a question?" Brittany's anger seemed to wane the slightest as she settled in the chair again. She gave a go-ahead nod. "Why did you send me the information about the murdered victims?" "I wanted you to tell the truth." Obviously that wasn't true, or at least not all of the truth, because Denise had told the truth. And yet, here they were. Had Brittany wanted Denise to figure it out? Maybe she'd hoped Denise would be able to stop her? She wanted to question her about it, but she couldn't figure out how without potentially making this already bad situation worse. "You should have warned me." Brittany's words were cold, emotionless. "You claim we were friends, but you never told me." "It was... You let me go to that casting call." "I didn't know. If I'd known..." "What, you would have confessed everything?" "Yes." Denise never would have sent her friend to audition for Vaughn without warning her. Brittany was right, though. Denise's silence had allowed other women to walk into that situation. Her silence had been damaging. Could she have stopped him? Maybe. Maybe not at the time. Nobody would have listened to her. But later, When she gained fame and fortune, she could have told the truth. Should have told the truth. She could admit that now. Admit that her shame had kept her silent and had put others in danger. You didn't tell me you were going to one of his casting calls. Denise kept her voice gentle. Where was it? Philadelphia. There was a boxing movie. Oh, I didn't know. And how could you have? You were all wrapped up in filming, in your own success, riding your star to the top. Her words dripped with derision. And now that you've achieved all that, you come home, and everything goes back to normal for you. Wasn't that Reed beside you in line at the school? It was. So you get the husband back, get your daughter back, keep your success. No consequences for people like you. Wow. Denise probably should have kept the humorless chuckle inside. And you say I didn't care about you. You obviously know nothing about my struggles, what I've dealt with. Wah, wah, wah. Hold on while I grab a tissue. Up until yesterday, Brittany, Reed despised me. The only reason we have this tentative truce is because I told him everything. About Vaughn, about rehab, about why I did what I did. And that truce is brand new. I don't have Reed back. I'll never have him back. Not that she wanted Reed, but it wouldn't help her to say so. The man she really wanted was probably out there now, planning to put his life in danger to save hers. The thought of John nearly brought a fresh round of tears. If Brittany killed her, would John blame himself? She could still see the look on his face when she'd closed the classroom door. Frustration, irritation. Denise should have listened to him. She should have trusted his instincts over her own. Even though this was her fault, John would blame himself. If Denise died here, would he ever trust in Christ? Brittany said, "It's just a matter of time before he falls at your feet like everybody else." Reed is happily married. They're about to have a baby. And Ella? You think that's a walk in the park? I'm trying to rebuild a relationship with her after abandoning her. Anger leached into her tone. So don't sit there and act like everything works out for Denise Masters. It hasn't been all rainbows and puppies for me, you know. Brittany's eyes hardened, and she lifted the gun, staring through the sights. Are you really trying to make me feel sorry for you? A tactical error. She should be appealing to Brittany's sympathy, not challenging her to a whose life is worse duel. Mostly, she wanted to keep the conversation going. Maybe when John got there, he'd get her out of this. Maybe he could save her. Please, Lord, protect me. Protect John and his team. I'm sorry. Denise took a breath, trying to look sorry, even if she didn't feel it. I don't mean to diminish what you've gone through. Brittany lowered the gun slightly. Trying to break in for all those years, Denise hurried to say. Being denied, even though you're every bit as good an actor as I am. Though that was questionable. Brittany was decent, but her arrogance had never helped her. And then you had to deal with Vaughn and his evil. Me, on the other hand, I got my agent, some early work, then Ember Flare. That was luck, I know that. And I know you didn't have the same fortune on your side. I don't know what would have happened to me if I hadn't had that early success. Would I have gone home, made a life with Reed and Ella? Probably not. More likely, I'd have found solace in a bottle, in drugs. I probably would have overdosed. The truth of her words hit her anew. She owed so much to God. She could give her success and fame credit for the turnaround her life had taken, but those hadn't saved her. If anything, they'd made everything worse. Only God had the power to pull Denise out of that trap. Only God could save her now. The point is, Denise continued. What was the point again? Oh, right. Keep Brittany talking. The point is, you and I shouldn't be enemies. We were both hurt. We both dealt with it in our own ways. I wish I'd done everything differently. Told Reed. Reported the attack to the police. Sought counseling and overcome my depression and anxiety and all the things resulting from Vaughn's attack and the postpartum. I wish I'd done that instead of running away. I live with regret every single day of my life. Sure you do. By Brittany's tone, she didn't believe a word Denise said. How was Brittany any different? She'd been attacked, and for that, Denise was sorrier than her ex-friend would ever believe. But her reaction was to murder the women who'd been attacked before her? That was insanity. Pure insanity. Explain something to me, Denise said. You're angry with me for not having told you what Vaughn did. You're angry with all those women you murdered because they didn't tell. And yet, as far as I can figure, you didn't tell either. Maybe if you'd come forward. I made it stop. By killing the victims? How did that stop Vaughn? A slow smile spread across Brittany's face. Trust me. Weirdly, Denise nodded toward the gun. I don't. Brittany's expression morphed to irritation. I was going to report him, but I did enough research to know that reporting him wouldn't do any good. The police wouldn't believe me. Vaughn would offer me money to keep me quiet. So instead, I got close to Rybold and figured out who else Vaughn had done this to. Then, I presented the evidence to Vaughn. What I knew, my plan to get each of his victims to admit what happened. I figured if we all agreed to come forward together, publicly, no prosecutor could refuse to look into it. He agreed that would be unfortunate, was the word he used. So he started paying me. Denise leaned back, shocked. You're angry with those women for profiting off their rapes when you blackmailed him? You did the exact same thing. That answered one question that had dogged Denise for days. Where Brittany had gotten the money to start an art gallery. And traveling to find new artists was the perfect cover for her visits to the West Coast. It wasn't the same. Brittany jiggled the gun as if to emphasize her point. It wasn't. I told him if it ever happened again, I'd tell the whole story. I stopped him. But how would Brittany know if Vaughn ever did it again? How was Brittany to know if there were new victims who kept silent like all the others had? Denise wasn't stupid enough to point out the obvious, and she couldn't quite figure out how Brittany went from stopping Vaughn to murdering his victims. A check in her spirit stopped her from asking. Maybe she didn't need Brittany rehearsing the reasons why Vaughn's victims had needed to die. Not while Denise sat on the wrong end of a gun. Where was John? Even if he made it to this little building in the middle of nowhere, how could he possibly rescue her? There were no windows. All the doors were closed. John wouldn't be able to see inside, to see where Brittany and Denise were situated. If Brittany wanted to murder Denise, she would. Simple as that. Lord, you see me. You know. Give John wisdom. Guide him and his team. Protect them. Save me, Lord. I don't want to die here.
Chapter 31. John moved silently through the woods, Grant at his side. They both carried flashlights, but neither lit them now. There was enough light from the moon shining through the clouds and the reflection on the snow, and they didn't want to alert anybody to their presence. This would have been better with more men, but enlisting the help of the rest of the team would have meant involving Coate and the police. He didn't know the older chief very well, but he figured there was no way the guy would have authorized this plan. Jones had related what was going on at the farm stand. Coate was waiting for John to let him know what he'd learned, placating him. He could imagine Jones now. Be patient. John's never in any hurry, but he knows what he's doing. When he has a handle on the situation, he'll let us know. Coate was probably fit to be tied, pacing, knowing John and his guys were at the abandoned store. But Coate wasn't stupid. He wasn't going to let his pride jeopardize the opportunity to rescue Denise. For that, John respected the local police chief. He'd worked with plenty of arrogant cops in his life, the kinds who'd rather lose than take outside help. At the signal, nobody would miss the signal. Coate and his guys would rush up, swarm the building, Jones and the rest of the team offering their assistance. God willing, by the time they arrived, Denise would be safe. God willing. John had faced his share of danger. He'd tracked down terrorists and gone head-to-head with drug lords. He'd rescued a dignitary once, not to mention 13 kidnapped models. He'd done all that with his team, relying on his own skills and the training he'd received from Uncle Sam. He'd never once expected God's help. Honestly, he'd never thought he needed it. He was capable of doing what had to be done all by himself, thank you very much. Talk about arrogant. Even when it had been Lake and her sister who'd required rescue, he'd relied on himself and his team. Even then, he hadn't lifted a single prayer for help. Was it because of the conversations he'd had this week about God? Was it because he'd seen Josie and Thomas's faith that summer and seen them survive when they probably should have been killed? Or was it because this wasn't a stranger or a client or even his cousin? This was Denise. the woman he loved. He didn't know for sure what had him whispering prayers now, but they slipped out of his mouth, soundlessly, but no less there. Save her. Help us save her. Protect her. Guide us. Did God answer those kinds of prayers? Did he listen to people who weren't even sure he existed? John had no idea. He only knew, hoped anyway, that the prayers wouldn't hurt. She loves you, God. She trusts you. Save her. Please. He and Grant reached the woods at the side of the building, out of sight of the windows, and paused to wait for Hughes's signal. The night before, John had done what Lake suggested. He'd asked God to reveal himself. If he was real, then John needed to know. He wasn't about to lose Denise because he was too stubborn to at least try to understand what she believed. So he'd asked, and God had been silent. What had he expected? An angel choir? Would God reveal himself now? If you're really there. The words that wanted so badly to follow felt like an ultimatum. Would that offend God? Did he have anything to lose? If you're really there, and if you really love Denise, if you really love me, then do your thing. Save her. Protect my team. Please save Denise. There. He'd said it, and he hadn't been consumed by fire raining from the sky. Not yet anyway. So maybe nobody heard his prayers. Maybe there was nobody listening. Or if God was there, maybe he didn't care. Or maybe, just maybe, he was going to help. Hughes's voice sounded loud in his ear. Charges set! Moving in. John and Grant bolted from the tree line beside the building to the front door, crossing in front of the windows as quickly as possible. If anybody was watching, they'd be sitting ducks. But the lack of light in that big room, and the fact that it was exposed to the outside, had him betting that Brittany and Denise were elsewhere. When no shots were fired, he figured he'd bet correctly. While he stood guard, Grant picked the lock. Considering that the building was deserted, they assumed there was no alarm system. They assumed, in fact, that there was no power at all. They should be safe to walk right in the front door. Another risk, but there was no time to contact the electric company to confirm. Anyway, it would only be a matter of seconds, and Hughes and Ian covered the back door. As long as Brittany's first instinct was to save herself and not kill her hostage, this should work, assuming Denise wasn't already dead. Please, God, please. Grant got the door open. Flashlights shining, they stepped into a large open room. A counter ran the length of one side. Old racks of very narrow shelves had been pushed to one wall. The floor was covered in thin, cheap industrial carpet, which muffled their footsteps. They moved to the back of the room, where an opening revealed a short hallway. John angled into the space, light shining ahead, prepared to duck and fire. But the hall was empty. There were two closed doors. A sign on one indicated a bathroom. The other door would open to a space that led to the rear exit. A dark exit sign overhead confirmed his guess. A dim light glowed beneath it. Denise and Brittany had to be in there. He listened. No sound but silence. Were they both dead? Murder-suicide? An image filled his mind. Denise splayed out on the floor, blood seeping from a fatal wound. He shook it off. Contemplating the worst wouldn't help. He held his gun at the ready and checked Grant, who nodded. John tapped his comm unit 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. An explosion shook the building's foundation. Grant kicked in the door, and John stepped through and aimed, searching for a target. The room was empty.
Chapter 32. It had all happened so fast. 1 minute, Brittany had been telling Denise about Vaughn and blackmail and victims. Once Denise had gotten her talking, Brittany couldn't seem to stop. Denise guessed she'd been dying to tell her everything she'd done from the first gruesome murder to the last. The woman seemed proud of herself, actually proud, for having gotten away with it, and for the way she'd framed Vaughn. She'd been in the middle of explaining her grand getaway scheme when she'd glanced at her phone, as she'd done multiple times since they'd arrived. Only this time, she'd popped to her feet, shock evident in her wide eyes and dropped jaw. And then, she'd pulled Denise up from the floor, yanked open the door, and shoved her into the short hallway. Denise had no idea what was going on, but her questions were met with, "Shut up and do what you're told." Denise didn't fight as Brittany propelled her down the hall to a restroom. It was a tiny, mold-scented space built for one person, but Brittany pushed them both inside. She closed the door and, by the light of her cell phone, whipped Denise around, putting her between the doorway and Brittany. It seemed Denise would be playing the part of a human shield. They stood between the toilet and the wall. The metal edge of a toilet paper dispenser dug into Denise's thigh, but that was easily ignored as Brittany shut off the cell's flashlight and snaked her arm around Denise's neck. With her other hand, she held the gun against Denise's head. "What are we—" "Shut up!" Brittany hissed. They stood like that, Brittany uttering a stream of curse words under her breath, while Denise prayed a stream of prayers. Had John found them? Was he out there? Before she could allow hope to fill her being, an explosion rocked the building, sending vibrations beneath her feet. Another sound, a bang, came almost simultaneously. Denise gasped, but her air was cut off when Brittany pulled her back and squeezed her hold against Denise's airway. Only a second passed before she seemed to get her bearings again and let up a little. Denise sucked in a breath, grateful for the filth-scented oxygen. Brittany whispered so low it was more breeze than sound. Not a word. With the cold steel of the pistol pressed against her temple, she wasn't about to argue. As fast as all the chaos had erupted, it died. The silence was charged, buzzing with tension. It was only a matter of time before they were discovered. Brittany had to know that. What was her plan? She'd so meticulously strategized the blackmail scheme and all her other murders, working it out so that Vaughn would be the perfect scapegoat. But she hadn't intended any of this. Suddenly, the door in front of them slammed open. Brittany aimed toward it and fired, but nothing was silhouetted in the opening. All Brittany had accomplished was to confirm where they were. Silence reigned again, heavy with pressure. But now Denise could make out sounds of a third person breathing. "There's no way out of this for you, Brittany." John's voice sounded calm and clear from the other side of the doorway, and Denise's heart expanded. Of course he was there. Of course he'd come to rescue her. "Please, Lord, don't let anything happen to him." "You're trapped," John said. "The building is surrounded. Even if you could manage to get away, we know who you are. Why don't you put your gun down?" "If you come in here, I'll kill her." The quiet lasted a few beats before John asked, "Ms. Masters, are you all right?" Ms. Masters. Denise was glad she hadn't told Brittany anything about her feelings for John. She started to answer, but Brittany squeezed against her windpipe again, silencing her. "She's fine. If I don't hear her say it, I'm not going to believe it. The only reason I'm out here, and you're in there, is because I assume my client is still alive. I suggest you let her speak for herself." The pressure against Denise's neck eased just a little. She cleared her throat, which felt bruised and scratchy. "I'm here." "Are you injured?" John asked. "Brittany hasn't hurt me." "Not much, anyway." "Good, good." John's tone was all business. "Brittany, your best shot is to surrender." "That's not going to happen," Brittany said. "I'm not going to prison." "Prison's better than dead." "I doubt that." "Oh, I don't know." His tone was matter-of-fact. "The way the justice system works nowadays, you'll probably get off on a technicality or released on parole in a couple of years." "I'm not stupid," Brittany snapped. "Don't treat me like I am." "I know you're not stupid. You've gotten away with way too much for anybody to believe that." When John spoke again, his voice was low and serious. "What do you want?" Brittany didn't seem to know how to answer, and John's question hovered in the silence, the heaviness weighing them all down. Because, the truth was, Brittany only had two options here, death or surrender, and she'd already said she wouldn't surrender. If she chose death, the only question remaining was one Denise was afraid to consider. Did Brittany plan to take her with her to the grave? "If you surrender to me," John said, "I'll tell the police how you cooperated, how you laid down your weapon because you weren't willing to hurt anybody else. But the hostage negotiators are on the way. Once they get here, I won't be able to help you." "You don't want to help me." Brittany's words were too loud, echoing off the hard walls. "You'll say anything to get me to lay down this gun. Well, forget it. I knew when I started that this would be the end for me. Denise was my last target. Once she's dead, my crusade will be over. Everybody will remember me, as the woman who brought Vaughn down. Not Denise, not Shannon Butler. Her words dripped with contempt. Or any of those other so-called starlets. The world will remember me. Denise closed her eyes, but tears leaked between her lids. She didn't want to die in this filthy bathroom. Not like this. Not now, when things were finally starting to go her way. She didn't want to die at the hands of her former best friend. She didn't want Ella to have to bury her mother. She didn't want Reed to stand at her graveside. She didn't want John to live with the what-ifs. Please, God, please show us a way out of this. But if this is the end for me, lead John to you, save him, and protect my baby. Draw her to you. Don't let this or anything else separate her from you. You don't really want to kill Denise, do you, Brittany? John asked. I know she can be self-absorbed, but do you really want to live with murdering your friend? Maybe she wasn't that great at it, the whole friendship thing, but you two had your moments, didn't you? Denise's first instinct was to be offended, but she brushed those feelings aside. John was trying to connect with Brittany. Denise, Brittany, and Ben and Jerry's, if I'm remembering right, John said. Denise's favorite was Cherry Garcia, but you liked, was it Chunky Monkey? Brittany went very still behind her. Maybe John's words were having an impact. You were friends then. I'm not saying Denise is perfect. God knows she's far from it. But if you shoot her, then I have to shoot you. And I really don't want to have to shoot you. If you put down the gun, we can all walk away from this. Your old friend will still be breathing, and maybe she'll even have a chance to make it up to you. All the mistakes she made. You'll survive, be able to tell your story. He chuckled. Heck, you'll probably get a book deal out of the whole thing. Maybe one of those A&E specials. He'd missed his calling. John was nudging all of Brittany's wants front and center. Maybe this would work. Maybe John would be able to get them out of this. But after a protracted silence, Brittany barked a laugh. They don't give book deals to serial killers. They interview them, though, with cameras and lights, and that's assuming you're convicted. As far as I know, the authorities haven't found anything that links you to the murders. Your name never came up in my conversation with the California investigator. With a good attorney, you may get off scot-free. But in order to do that, you have to put the gun down. Please, God, please let her... You must think I'm an idiot, Brittany snapped. There's no way out of this for me, and if that's the case... Again, her arm tightened around Denise's neck. She shifted the gun so the end of the barrel pressed against Denise's head, just over her ear. The cold steel pressed through her hair and sent a shiver of terror down her body and a gasp through her lips. Protect the ones I love, Lord. Hold them close. John sighed, long and loud. Hey, Denise. He addressed her by her first name. Maybe he realized what she had, that Brittany wasn't going to surrender, that this was the end for Denise. What would he say, knowing these might be the last words he would ever speak to her? Would he tell her again that he loved her? She wished she could tell him exactly how she felt. Because somehow, after all of this, she knew she loved him. It was new and tender, like a spring flower just peeking out of the ground after a long, cold winter. But there was something there, something that could have been amazing. Yes? She heard the breathless, desperate hope in her single word. This is your fault. She sucked in her shock. What? What do you... I had one rule. Do you remember the one rule? Hurt and heartbreak filled her voice. Do as you say. If I say stop, you stop. If I say jump, you say, how high? The words were automatic, but that was exactly the opposite of what he'd told her. You don't say anything, you just jump. And you couldn't do it, John said, his voice hard. You couldn't just do as you were told. But she hadn't defied him, had she? Sure, he'd been uncomfortable with her going into that classroom with Brittany alone, but he hadn't told her not to. He hadn't tried to stop her. And anyway, that wasn't his favorite example. He'd always said, oh, Brittany laughed. Still the arrogant little know-it-all, aren't you? She let up the pressure on Denise's neck. You always did think you were better than everybody else. There might be 3 of us here, Denise, but you're going to die alone. Just like... Duck! Denise let her legs go out from under her and yanked her head down. John spun into the room and fired. Denise had barely gotten to her knees when Brittany collapsed on top of her. The woman's weight was immediately yanked off and pulled away. John dropped her on the floor between the vanity and the wall. He stood over her, gun aimed at her head. Grant stepped into the tiny room, gun raised, flashlight scanning the space. John flipped Brittany over. She stared up at the ceiling, eyes open and vacant, a tiny hole on her forehead. Denise couldn't inhale, couldn't breathe. Before she could force out the scream that desperately wanted escape, John scooped her into his arms. Move! Grant stepped out of the way, and John carried Denise from the room, through a larger space, and outside. Breathe, he said. She blew out a breath and sucked in another. That's good, again. She did as she was told. You're safe now. He tucked her close to his chest and marched through a parking lot. The temperature wasn't much colder than it had been inside, but it was fresh and clean, not tainted with the sense of mold and dust and death. Blue and red lights spun, illuminating John's face. She couldn't seem to pry her eyes away from him. She still wasn't sure exactly what had happened. She was alive. And Brittany was... She buried her head against John's shoulder. It's okay, he said. You're safe now. Voices rose all around, men running, vehicles moving. Denise couldn't make sense of any of it. She didn't want to. John set her down on something soft and tried to back away, but she wouldn't release her grip on his jacket. She couldn't seem to make her fists unclench. He spoke over her head. I don't think she's injured, just in shock. Okay, ma'am, can you lie back? She gripped tighter, leaning toward John as if he were her only link to life. A blanket was laid over her shoulders, but she ignored it. She was freezing, but she didn't need a blanket. She needed John's warmth. He would be enough. Gently, he pried her fingers off. When he had her hands in his, he crouched down to meet her eyes. Sweetheart, you need to let the paramedics check you out. Don't leave, please. He leaned forward and kissed her cheek. I just need to talk to the chief. He nodded to his right, and she glanced to where the chief of police waited. And then I'll be right back, okay? She was safe, wasn't she? John met her eyes again. You did good. Very obedient, just like you trained me. I knew you'd figure it out. He kissed her forehead and backed away. I'll be right back. Gentle hands tucked a blanket around her. While the paramedic asked her questions, she kept her gaze on the man who'd saved her life. The man she didn't want to live without.
Chapter 33. John kept one eye on Denise as he answered the chief's questions. He expected Coate to be furious with him for entering the building without clearing it with him first. By the time the chief had figured out what was going on and joined him at the bathroom door, keeping very quiet, John had already gotten Brittany talking. The chief had kept silent at his side, but he'd heard the entire exchange. He'd agreed with John's assessment that Brittany had no plan to surrender. When John told him, via scribbled words in the chief's notebook, what he planned, the chief had studied the idea a long time, and then he'd nodded. Maybe the chief would have to face repercussions down the road, but John doubted it. Brittany Boatwright was a serial killer. If she'd been a man, nobody would question John's judgment. Funny how it felt different because of her gender. He'd never shot a woman before. He searched his heart for some feeling of remorse or regret, but all he could conjure was an immense sense of relief. The fact that Brittany was dead wasn't nearly as powerful to him as the fact that Denise was alive. He glanced her way but could barely see her seated on the gurney beyond the crowd. Reed hovered at her right, his wife at his side. James and Cassidy were there. Behind them was the other couple who joined them for the play, Andrew and Grace. Ella was sitting on her mother's lap. He'd been shocked to see the child there. But maybe like the rest of them, she'd needed to know her mother was all right. Do you have anything else to add? Chief Coate asked. He thought back to all he'd covered already, how they'd breached the building, set explosives to take out the van, and burst into the room where the dim light was shining beneath the door. How that room had been empty. How he'd confirmed his guess that they were in the bathroom. I can't think of anything else right now. The chief had heard most of what Brittany had to say. He'd heard her call herself a serial killer. Okay, go ahead then. He nodded toward Denise. We'll have to interview her next, so you might give her a heads up. Will do. Thanks, Chief. The older man gripped John's upper arm. That's twice now you've done our job for us. Some of my guys are a little miffed that you keep having all the fun. You? Coach shook his head slowly. Truth to tell, I'm old enough not to care who gets the credit. I'm just grateful. That word resonated as John walked toward Denise and her circle of friends. Grateful. That was exactly how he felt. He'd done it. He'd saved her, and he could admit it had been against all odds. He hadn't had any idea how he was going to get Brittany to put down her gun or get a clean shot. The idea to warn Denise that she'd need to duck, could he take credit for that? For any of it? No. It had been an inspired idea. Inspired by the one he'd pleaded with for help. God had shown up. He'd done amazing things, and he'd used John to do them. Thank you. Again, the Lord didn't answer, but he felt a sense of peace and well-being like he hadn't known since he was a child. It was weird, especially in that setting, surrounded by ambulances and police cars and fire trucks. It didn't make any sense, but John felt God's pleasure. He reached the group surrounding Denise, and her friends shifted to make room for him. How you doing? She flashed that amazing smile his way. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but he guessed they were joyful, maybe a little overwhelmed. I'm alive thanks to you. She giggled and squeezed her daughter closer. I was starting to think. She shook her head, perhaps unwilling to voice her fears in front of Ella. Ella was a smart girl, though. She slid out of her mother's arms and onto the asphalt, facing him. Did you save Mommy's life? He shrugged. I think God did it. Your mother and I helped. Ella launched herself across the circle and collided with him. Wrapping her arms around his waist, she buried her head in his stomach. Her muffled thank you vibrated against his jacket. He crouched down and lifted Ella to give her a proper hug. You are very welcome. He looked beyond Ella to Denise. It was a life worth saving. Reed shifted to face him. So, is it over? Mostly, John said. We just need to locate Vaughn and confirm Brittany's story. I know where he is, Denise said. John wasn't the only one who focused on her, but Denise's gaze flicked to Ella, and she shook her head. Suffice it to say, he won't be hurting anybody anymore. Vaughn was dead? Brittany must have confessed to that before John showed up. Coat's going to need to talk to you, he said. You can give him the details then. Now, she asked, whenever you're ready. Maybe you should get some rest, Reed suggested. Talk to him tomorrow. John was about to protest, but Denise beat him to it. I'm not as fragile as I look. I can handle it. Fragile? Despite his initial assessment, Denise Masters was anything but fragile, and she was no more a prima donna than Lake was. Denise was tough, yet tender, vulnerable, yet strong, beautiful, yet there was no contrast to that one. She was just beautiful, inside and out. She hopped off the gurney, keeping the blanket around her shoulders. Let's get it over with. She turned to Reed. Why don't you take Ella home and... No, Mommy, I want to stay with you. Denise crouched in front of her. How about I stop by your house later and tuck you in? She looked up at Reed. Would that be all right? Reed nodded. The man seemed too overwhelmed to speak. Ella said, You promise you'll come? I promise I'll come. If you're asleep before I get there, I'll wake you up, okay? Ella agreed. After Jackie, James, and Cassidy all hugged Denise, Jackie took Ella's hand and led her toward the cars parked in the far corner of the lot. James and Cassidy with her. The other couple, Andrew and Grace, were waiting there. But Reed lingered. He seemed conflicted about something, and then he pulled Denise into a tight hug. I'm so glad. Again, he shook his head, unable to speak. Denise didn't say anything either, just hugged him back. John squelched the rise of jealousy. Their love wasn't romantic. That Reed adored his wife was as plain as the woman's red hair. What Reed and Denise felt for each other was another kind of love, the kind that held families together no matter what. Reed stepped back. Turning to John, he stuck out his hand, which John shook. Thank you for saving her life. He only managed a mumbled "of course" before Reed swiveled and jogged to catch up with his wife and daughter. Denise watched them walk away. Wow. John slid his arm around her waist. You have quite a family here. She looked up at him, tears shimmering in her eyes. I'm very blessed. Blessed indeed. He felt exactly the same.
Chapter 34. Denise waited outside the front door of Ella's school, watching for John. She hadn't seen him since the early hours of Saturday morning, 2 weeks before. He'd stayed beside her that night as she'd answered all the chief's questions, telling him everything that had happened between the time Brittany had forced her out that schoolroom window to when John showed up. Just before Brittany had seen men on the battery-operated video camera she'd installed near the back door, she'd confessed to murdering Vaughn. Apparently, he'd figured out that she was the one killing his victims, and that she was setting him up for the murders. She always ensured he was close by, planning to meet him to get her blackmail money near where she planned her next kill. She'd threatened him, telling him that if he went forward with the information, she'd tell the police he was the murderer. He'd let it go on for a while, more worried about saving his own reputation than the women he'd violated. But as the murders became more frequent, Vaughn suffered an attack of conscience and threatened to go to the police. So Brittany had lured him to a boat dock, murdered him, and dragged his body onto a rented boat. She'd motored out into the deep water and dropped him in the ocean. Then, she'd used his phone to text his assistant and his kids, telling them he was going on an extended vacation. They found Vaughn's phone at Brittany's condo in Portsmouth. Denise had no idea if Vaughn's body would ever be found. She hoped so, for his family's sake, but she wasn't going to lose any sleep over it. The man had been a monster, obviously. Attacking women was one thing, but then to let them be murdered, one by one, while keeping quiet to protect his reputation? He'd gotten what he deserved. The thought brought her up short. The last thing, the very last thing Denise wanted, was to get what she deserved. Thank you, Lord, for your mercies. She'd sinned enough in her past to pray that prayer every day of her life. After Denise had answered all of Coates' questions that night, John had driven her to Reed's house, where she woke her daughter to kiss her goodnight. Then, John had taken her home. Though the rest of his team was gone, he'd stayed in her guest house one more time. But the next day, after they'd enjoyed breakfast together, he'd left. She'd spent the day fearing that their brief, non-romance romance was over. But he'd called her that night, and every night since. In 2 weeks, they'd talked on the phone for probably 200 hours. They'd talked about everything from their childhoods to their hopes for the future. And they talked about God. A lot. She'd passed along the thick book about the evidence for the Bible and Christ, and John had read it, the entire 800-plus page book. By the time he finished, he was telling Denise things she'd either forgotten or never known. The man was brilliant. She smiled just thinking of their long conversations and brief silences that felt not strained but comfortable. John was so much more than a bodyguard. He was a Renaissance man. He knew something about everything. She wasn't sure she'd ever met anyone so intelligent, and the fact that he'd spent his life protecting people, even though he could have done so many other things, only made him more attractive. The night before, he'd prayed on the phone with her, trusting Jesus and turning from his sins. His humility, his already swelling faith. She was in love. It was ridiculous. She'd known him for exactly 3 weeks, and they'd never even kissed. But she was head over heels in love. Now she stood outside the school, all alone. No bodyguards flanked her or ushered her inside. She was safe, finally. The media had been frenzied for a few days, but then another story had presented itself, and they'd left Coventry. Even the steady stream of fans driving by her house had waned to a trickle. Denise was safe in Coventry. Reed and Jackie showed up, greeted her, and went inside to Ella's classroom. Denise glanced at her watch. John had about 4 more minutes before she'd have to go in without him. But seconds later, he pulled to a stop in front of her and rolled down his passenger window. I'm going to park, and I'll be right there. Okie dokie. Her voice was high and excited, but there was nothing she could do about that. He'd come. He'd really driven the hours north from his Massachusetts home to see her. He had said he would, but the way her heart pounded told her she'd doubted him. Stupid. If anybody would be true to his word, John would. And she knew why, too. He'd told her a little over 2 weeks before how he felt about her, and he wasn't a fickle man or one given to whims of fancy. If he said he loved her, then he loved her. Simple as that. Simple and profound and amazing and, thank you, Lord. She bounced on her toes until 2 minutes later, John jogged toward her. He opened his arms, and she stepped into them for a brief hug before taking his hand. Come on, we have to hurry. I'm sorry I'm late. I ran into traffic coming through town. There seems to be some sort of festival or something. She laughed. There's always some kind of festival in Coventry. They really need to fix the traffic problem. Denise waved to the secretary inside the little office. She'd already checked herself and John in, and hurried to Ella's classroom, which was crowded with parents and students. There weren't chairs for the adults, so she and John stood beside Reed and Jackie and watched the kids' presentations. While the teacher held up each gratitude wreath, each child stood at the front of the room and explained what theirs stood for. As expected, Ella's friend Clara talked all about horses. Jansen the bully talked about being grateful for his little sister. His mother, holding a squirming 2-year-old, smiled fondly at him. Finally, it was Ella's turn. She grabbed her wreath, which Denise had wrapped in a sheet that morning before driving Ella to school, and handed it to her teacher. Then she removed the sheet with a flourish. Sometimes Denise saw herself in her amazing daughter. When Ella turned to the audience, all smiles and confidence, Denise beamed with pride. Ella didn't look a bit nervous as she pointed to the ornaments, explaining each one. She started with her grandparents, then moved on to Jackie. Denise caught Reed swiping a tear from beneath his eye when she pointed to him and called him the world's greatest daddy. She moved on to the bright red heart. This one is for my mommy, because she said that I never left her heart, and she never left mine. Denise had to swipe at her own tears. And then Ella pointed to something Denise hadn't seen before. It was a red foam cutout shaped like a flowing cape. There was a yellow S on it. Ella pointed to it and said, "This is a Superman cape for Mr. John." John startled beside Denise, and she slipped her hand in his and squeezed. Ella continued, "That's because he's even more of a superhero than Mommy. She only plays a superhero in movies, but Mr. John is like a real one. He saved Mommy's life." John's face flushed as people turned to look. Reed clapped him on the shoulder. Denise leaned closer, squeezing his hand again. Ella waved at him, and he waved back, eliciting chuckles from some of the parents. It was a sweet moment, maybe a funny moment, but also an incredibly important moment, because Ella already understood something important, that John belonged. Somehow, in the course of the week he'd spent with them, he'd carved out a place for himself in their family. His 2-week absence had done nothing to change that. The presentation ended with cookies and refreshments. After that, most of the families took their children and walked downtown to the festival. Denise and her family joined the throng. It was chilly, barely 30 degrees, and a few snowflakes drifted around them, but they were dressed for the weather. It seemed like there was always some reason for the folks of Coventry to celebrate. Unlike the Christmas tree lighting in the park a few weeks before, this one took place downtown. All the shops had moved some of their wares onto the sidewalks. The scent of pizza wafted from the place on the corner, but they walked right past. In front of the Patriot, James had set up a little fire pit where, for only $1, passers-by could roast marshmallows and make their own s'mores. Of course, Ella had to have one. Denise joined her, loving the familiar flavors that brought back memories of her own childhood. She barely noticed the sticky mess left on her fingers. Cassidy was there, jiggling her baby and handing out wet wipes. She gave Denise a quick side hug. "I love having you back. How long are you staying?" Both Ella and John turned to watch her answer. Neither had asked her that question recently, but she realized now that they'd both wondered. She'd said from the time she arrived in Coventry that she'd be staying through the holidays. But January was looming. I signed a new contract with the studio, but I don't start filming until next summer. I might have a few things I need to attend between now and then, but for the most part, I'll be here. Before Cassidy could respond, Ella yelled, "Until summer? And then I'll only be gone a few weeks before I come back." Ella gripped her around the waist and squeezed, probably leaving a sticky mess on Denise's jacket. Not that she cared. When Ella released her, the pure joy in her daughter's face made the sticky mess, and all she'd had to deal with in order to get here, worth it. "Did you hear that, Daddy?" "I did." Reed didn't seem a bit upset. Ella spun until she found a friend and told her Denise's news. The two girls chatted and giggled as if all was right in the world. John didn't say a word, but he wrapped his arm around Denise's waist and pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. Suddenly, she wished they weren't surrounded by people. Together, the group walked to the corner, where Cuppa Josie's had parked its truck. John introduced Denise to the brunette in the window, the owner, she guessed, since the woman's name was Josie, and the man beside her. Denise shook both their hands. To Thomas, she said, "We went to school together." "Long time ago?" "You might want to get on his good side," John said. "He's going to be the mayor in about a month." "Is that right? Congratulations." Thomas shrugged. "Thanks, I'm getting excited," though he looked nervous as he said it. Josie nudged his shoulder. "You're going to be great." He grinned at her. "With you by my side." John bought them all hot chocolates, and they continued along the sidewalk. Overhead, Sleigh Ride played on hidden speakers, and John sang along, low enough that only Denise could hear. Ella and her friends chatted while the parents visited. Some of them even talked to Denise, making her feel comfortable, as if she belonged. And she realized she did. She was exactly where she belonged. It was nearly dark by the time Reed announced it was time to head home. Ella whined that she wanted to stay with Denise, but he was firm. "You slept over at Mommy's last night." He stuck out his lower lip in a pout. "Don't you miss me?" She seemed to vacillate before she slid her hand into her father's. "I'll see you tomorrow, Mommy, right?" "Christmas shopping, just you and me." Ella skipped away, Reed and Jackie on her heels. Poor Jackie was more waddling than walking now, even though she still had 6 weeks before the baby would be born. As soon as they were out of sight, John gripped Denise's hand. "Shall we?" "Where are we going?" "Dinner, eventually." Eventually? What did that mean? He took her hand and led her down the block, away from the crowds and toward the park. He didn't pause as they crossed the street and stepped onto the sidewalk, continuing more slowly toward the towering Christmas tree that glittered against the night sky. He looked down at her. "I just thought you'd like to see it up close, since you didn't get to the other day." "I'd love to." The music faded as they moved. Though a couple of people skated on the rink, most of the crowd remained downtown. John led her to the foot of the tree and around to the side, where it was darker. And then he stopped and turned to her. "I thought they'd never leave." She giggled. "Were you eager?" "You have no idea." He set his hands on her hips and stepped close, and she understood why he'd lured her here. Because as much as they'd grown to care for each other, they'd never kissed. It was time to remedy that. John leaned close, his deep voice rumbling in her ear and sending shivers that had nothing to do with the cold skimming over her body. "I can't wait any longer." He shifted until they were face to face, pausing a hair's breadth away, giving her plenty of opportunity to refuse. No chance of that. She pressed her lips against his, and he kissed her softly, tenderly. But like him, she'd been patient. She didn't want to be patient anymore. She wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled him closer, probing his mouth, tasting hot chocolate and happiness. His hands against the small of her back, he pressed her against his chest. He deepened the kiss, sending warmth to the tips of her toes. She'd shared kisses with Hollywood heartthrobs, with casual dates, and even with her ex-husband, whom she'd adored. But never, never had she felt what she did in John's arms. as if he was the home she'd been longing for. When they came up for air, he pulled her against his chest, where she felt his heart pounding through his thin jacket. "Oh my," she said. He chuckled. "That was worth waiting for?" "Perfect." "I'm not sure. I think we'll need to practice, see if we can improve." She liked the sound of that. They stayed wrapped in each other's arms a long time. And then, he pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I don't know what this is going to look like." She leaned up to face him, not wanting to face reality, but knowing it was time. "I live here. That's not going to change." "I live in Massachusetts, but that is going to change as soon as I can figure out how to make it work. I can't just abandon my partners. Bartlett and Summer deserve—" "Summer?" John smiled. "Yeah, Lake. She said it was fine if I told you her real name. I mean, if this turns into— well, anyway, she said it was fine." But Denise was only half listening, turning the name over in her head. "Summer? Your cousin's name is Summer Lake?" He chuckled. "Her sisters are Misty and Crystal." Denise cracked up. "That's—" She wanted to say hilarious, but she didn't want to offend. But he laughed too. "My aunt wanted to give her girls happy names." His smile faded. "Maybe because they didn't live such happy lives. But you can see why Summer doesn't like people to know. Who's afraid of a bodyguard named Summer Lake?" "Oh, I don't know. She's pretty terrifying if you ask me." He shook his head. "Beneath the tough facade, she's got a heart of gold. You're going to love her, I promise." As if they'd be getting to know each other. As if this wasn't just a passing fancy. Which it wasn't. John had told her he wasn't a casual fling sort of guy. What he felt for Denise wasn't going to fade away. And her feelings for him grew stronger every single day. "I can't just leave Summer and Bartlett in the lurch," John said. "It's going to take some time, probably a few months, before I can move. After that, I have no idea what I'm going to do." His lips closed, and he looked beyond her for a moment. But then he smiled and met her gaze. "I've been praying about it, weird as that sounds, and this feels like the right thing." He suddenly sounded unsure. "Unless, what do you think?" "I think you're amazing, and God must have something even better for you." He gave her a knowing look. "No doubt about that. Anyway, it's going to take me some time to figure out how to make life in central New Hampshire work, especially if you'll be traveling. I mean, if we're together, I want to be together." He wasn't talking about the next few months now. He wasn't talking about the following summer. He was talking about forever. He watched her, maybe gauging her reaction. "Does that scare you? Am I coming on too strong?" She popped up to her tiptoes and pressed her lips against his. Their second kiss was impossibly better than their first. He was right. Practice was a very good idea. She wondered as their lips moved against each other's, if the kisses would just keep getting better and better. She pulled away, eliciting a groan from him that sent tingles down her spine. "I'm feeling a whole lot of things right now, but not one of them is fear." He leaned back and stared at her. "What are you feeling?" She knew what he was asking and contemplated making him sweat for a minute. But no. He'd been honest with her from the very start. Fearless in his honesty, she could do the same. Placing her hands on either side of his beautiful face, she gazed into his eyes. "I love you, John Donnelly. It's impossible and ridiculous to say such a thing to a man I've known for 3 weeks. But I love you. You're—" But the rest of her words were silenced when his lips pressed against hers. As snow fluttered all around, they settled into their third kiss. This one even sweeter than the second. Each one that followed held more promise than the last. The end.
You've been listening to Wreathed in Disgrace, written by Robin Patchen, narrated by Brian and Matilda. Copyright 2022 by Robin Patchen. Audio copyright 2024 by Robin Patchen.